So this is COMP2106, week 10. Today we're going to be going over Express and integrating React into our Express project. We're going to be using a boilerplate that already has a lot of the configuration done up. So to answer your question, Brando, we are not going to be using last week's code. I'm going to be cloning this down and making modifications to it first. And then once we get it to a good set and I kind of explain what we're doing for the configuration, then I can get you guys to just clone down my repository from GitHub. So yeah. So the issue kind of being when you start using a lot of these front-end frameworks is everyone wants to write code that is more recent. So JavaScript has gone through different versions. I don't know if you guys are familiar with terms like ES5 or ES6. See a couple head nods. So those are the different versions that have come out with JavaScript or ECMAScript, so the standard that JavaScript follows. So when new versions come out, it's great. Usually you'll have like a browser like Chrome that will adopt stuff like that very quickly. So you can start using new code. The only thing is when you're trying to provide an application to as many users as possible, sometimes the user is going to be using a browser that doesn't support that feature. So in a lot of cases, we end up putting in what are called polyfills. So polyfills are code that fills in the missing dependency that the browser doesn't support. So a good site for this is Can I Use, that allows you to just search either a spec for CSS, a spec for JavaScript, or HTML. So in this case, CSS grids is a good example. So it gives you a chart of which browsers support that feature that you're wanting to look at. So in this case, you can see green means that it's supported and that it meets the spec. Red means that it does not support it. And then yellow usually means that it has like a partial support and that there is some sort of usually a feature flag behind it. You can see right here there's like a green feature flag, meaning you have to turn it on. Or in this case, it's a partial support with a prefix. So why is this an issue? So when we start writing code, when you guys have used different programming, so let's say Java or C#, the code that you write in your source code is not the same code that you get when you compile it, which is not a big deal because you give them the compiled output and then they're able to run it. But because our source code is what gets compiled by the browser, we can't determine what code features are in the browser. So we have to sometimes put in polyfills, and there's a lot of helpful tools that come with it. So why am I explaining all of this? Is because when we use React, the most common kind of thing that people use is called Webpack. So Webpack is another tool created by Facebook that allows you to make development a lot easier and a lot smoother. So in here, there's going to be a config for both development and production, because of course we don't need the same tooling in production as we do in development. So this project already has a lot of this already set up, but there will be some things that we'll have to modify just to get this working. So with that being said, I'm going to download it. I'm going to git clone the repository. Oops. Clone it down into the current thing. I'm going to remove the .git folder, and I'm going to do a git init, git add .init, and I'm going to create a GitHub repository for today's week. So COMP2106, winter 2019, and week 10. Okay. So if I open this up in Visual Studio Code, just going to get rid of that. So some things that I'm going to remove just because we don't need it is we don't need a changelog, and we don't need the README file, and I'm going to remove the license. Going to remove that. And that's pretty much it. So with this, so we have Webpack, and this is the tool that it supports a lot of plugins that allow us to transform our code from more recent code, either ES7, ES6, into code that could run in Internet Explorer. So we have our config, and we're not going to have to touch that at all. But for those of you that are in, is it Sean's class that's using Vue.js? Or who is it that's using Vue? Albert. So Albert, if you guys are taking his class, has a server folder and a client folder for both the front-end code and the back-end code. So this is kind of similar. It has both of those. So we have our client, which will have all of our different components that we're going to be using on the front end. And then we have the server back end that has our kind of similar stuff. So we have our API, and then there's development and production. We will modify this a bit. You can pretty much just ignore a lot of these. It's just set up to be a lot easier to work with it. So what this does is it uses compression, so that way when you send files to the user, it's compressed in gzip or some other compression algorithm. And then development, we get our Webpack dev server, which allows us to do what is called hot module reloading, so you don't have to refresh your page when you update something. So it's kind of handy. So let's see. So inside of here, most of this is fine. Then we set up our API routes. So I'm going to create a folder called routes. And in here, I can just get rid of almost all of this. Let's just double check. Okay, so I'm just going to remove the API routes. And right here, I'll just do app.use on /API. We want to do require, and we'll say .API. And create API.js. Actually, I'm going to rename routes to being API. Okay. So in here, we're going to need to bring in express. So express equals require express. Fonts router equals express.router. And we want to module.exports our router. Okay. So I'm just going to run the code. Let's see. npm run dev, yep. So npm run dev. Oh, sorry, I have to npm install our modules. And I'll just get rid of some of the stuff that's in here. We don't need to have repository. Can keep that there. Our version is going to be 1.0.0. Move the author. Can keep that. All right, it looks good. So if I run npm run dev, okay. So now if I open up the application and go to localhost 3000, this is our application, and I will also strip down the front end. So we don't need any of the API, don't need any of our containers. We'll keep the components folder, but I'm going to delete everything that's inside of it. Keep app. Keep that. Index. Okay, logger. We don't need. UV theme we don't need. Reducers we don't need. Router we do need. Store we do not need. So store, router, UV theme, provider, UV theme. And I'll actually just take this and stick it in our app. So we want to import browser router as router, switch and route from React router DOM. Router component div. Very good. What's going on here? Okay, so that failed to compile with loader JS, get rid of. Okay, so now when we restart, yeah, okay, sorry about that. So git add cut, strip base, and push up. So now that I've stripped that all out, now we can actually start working on this. So if I'll throw the GitHub link into weekly learning, build content, web link. So GitHub code and submit. So now the code, if you want to pull it down onto your machine, is just on GitHub. And then after you pull it, just make sure that you have to do npm install when you're done. So, and this kind of comes into why sometimes there's a lot of work that's involved in development. So there's a lot of stuff that this comes with, which is really nice, that I stripped out. It comes with what is the library called? Intel. There we go. So this is a library for international like language. So being able to convert your application from English into French or any other language that you want to support. There's a couple different libraries that you can use. Obviously, for what we're building right now, we don't need any sort of different languages, so we can take that out. But the one thing that we are going to do is we need to be able to talk to our application. So I don't think it has it here. So we need, or we don't need it, but I find that it makes life a little bit easier. I'm going to install Axios so that we can make API calls to our server side. So I just typed in npm install /save and then Axios, spelled AXIOS. Yes, yeah, when you clone it down, yeah, do npm install. So correct. And I also just pushed up the project with Axios, so if it's easier to pull it again, you can do that, but just, yeah, it's AXIOS. So as you can see, we have kind of a blank application. And what I'm going to do is inside of our API, I'm going to set up router is usually lowercase, just to make it easier. So router.get, and I'm going to do test and request response next. I'm going to do res.json foo bar.
This is the indexing client side?
In server. Yeah. So this can be where it gets to be a little much, where you start to have an index file that's both for your server and an index file that is in, the index file is under server API. Yeah. So because we're working in JavaScript both on the front end and the back end, it can sometimes, you might get a little lost on which file that you're in, which is perfectly normal. Happens to me sometimes. So if I type in API/test, yeah, sorry, I'm just making sure it just didn't do what I thought it was going to do is all. So that's listening, set up app routes, so app.use API. So sorry. So right now I'm just writing in a test, so that way when I go to what should be /API/test, it should respond back in a JSON format. What this application does, which is quite nice, is if you end up doing a GET request or a regular, you hit the page, on anything that's not /API, it should respond back with our application. So that way it'll automatically handle any sort of like routing on the client side instead of having to handle it on the server side. So it always responds up with our index.html, and then when that boots in, it'll read the URL and determine which route we should go on the front end. It's just what people typically do. You'll see it in a lot of like tutorials. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I think I just need to move this higher up. No, that should be fine. So app.use on /API, we want to require that in.
Should we be doing this?
No, I'm just testing why this isn't doing what it's supposed to be.
Okay.
So /API. Compiler, that's all fine. Okay. App use API.
I know you're dealing with your own problem. I'm going to have another one now.
Okay.
I can't even do run dev.
You did npm install, and it's still not working?
It's saying related to npm not being able to find a file, and it's saying no such file or directory to package.json.
Okay. I will try to help you out in a second. So I'm just gonna, that's literally all of this is fine. So app.use /API. It's not running this on 2 ports, is it? Because that might. Node server index. Okay. Why is this not working? I'm just going to take out logger. Okay, so I think I got it working. I don't know.
What do you do? Or are you just gonna push it and we'll pull it?
Yeah, I'll do that. I don't know if it's trying to cache something, which I hope not. That's what I'm just trying to make sure. Sanitize. Oh, okay. I figured it out. Life's really rough.
Yeah.
Okay, so who remembers why we use nodemon?
To watch and wait for changes and update on changes.
And why do we do that?
So we don't have to restart the server.
Yes. So that means when we change code to the server and it won't make any changes to it until we refresh. So everything that I've just been doing for the last 10, 15 minutes, I just needed to restart the server.
Well, mine won't run.
Yeah, I mean that is also a bigger issue if it's not running. But inside of here, I'm just going to quickly install this, just make life a little bit easier. npm install --save dev nodemon. Okay, so I'm just going to take a quick break from just like trying to get this going, and I'm just going to walk around and try to help people getting this on their machine. Because if it's not working at all on yours,
can you push it once you've done that?
Yeah.
See if it works?
Okay.
So you did, what was that npm --save?
You just did install dev.
I did save -dev. That means that it installs nodemon as a development dependency instead of a regular dependency. It doesn't really matter. The only thing is when you install your node modules on a server, like a production server, you can just give it a flag to not install anything that's a dev dependency because it takes longer, right? So, okay. So now if I restart this, okay. So I apologize for that small hiccup. Okay, so I pushed it up. So now if I go to just /, we get our application, and if I go to /API, we get an API response. So that's how it should be working. That's good. I would have figured out that it wasn't nodemon at some point, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, when we started making API calls and nothing was working, we'd figure it out. So now if I go to /API/test, make sure that our route file is set up correct. It is. So now we're good to go. So I'm going to remove this. Okay. Okay. So now that we finally have our application, we need to set it up so that way we can start doing something else. So I'm going to quickly make a second component just so that way you guys can see the difference of it. So I'm going to have a login component that just says login and a test component that just says index. And I'm going to give the login page our login component and the index page test. This is in client app.js. So if you see like React or anything, that's always going to be under client. And the reason why I'm just doing that is if I refresh here, it says index, but if I go to /login, it now says login. So this is the front end application handling. It automatically knows where we are and will handle it for us. So just to do that. So you guys are usually familiar with doing like in this class when we've done our forms, we've done them in Pug, and then when we've done our forms, we write it in Pug. And then we handle it on the server and then end up sending it to Pug. What this is going to do, which is a little bit different, is we don't actually leave the page. We're going to make a request when we're on the login form, and then we're going to receive a response back and handle it either a success or a failure on that page without having to leave at all. So I'm going to create a folder. So components, and feel free to do your own structure. There's no right or wrong way. But typically when I work, I have two folders. I'm going to have a folder called components, and components are where anything that can be reused in your application is going to live. And then I'm going to have a pages component, and that will be a representation of an entire page. So I'm just going to create pages and create login.jsx. And I'm going to create index.jsx.
And your pages and all, like
Source client pages.
Yeah, are you using Pascal for like layout on layout?
I just keep, so folders should be in lowercase unless if it's the name of a component. So like pages is just where all your pages are going to be, and in this case I have index and login. They're both capitalized. But if I wanted to have a folder that's just for, let's say, about us page, I'd do about us and then do index.jsx inside there. So if the folder is going to be for a specific component, because what's nice about folder structure is you can actually use a folder and just say about us, and if you have an index.jsx or an index.js file in there, it will automatically pull that in without having to specify it. So when you do a require. But just to make it easier, I don't see a point in creating a folder because the page should just be with what we make. So for our index page, we're going to import React from React and create, so I'm going to do a class component. So class index extends react.component. And we're going to do a render method that returns a div that says index page. And then I'm going to export default index. And I'm going to copy this to our login page and do the exact same thing and just change index to being login and say login page. Okay. So now we have the actual component made. Now we just get to fill in what's going to be there, which will be used inside of our, we'll create a component for the different elements. But in, oh, yep, sorry. I'm gonna bump up the font size. Give me one sec. Should be a little bit better. Is that easier to read?
Yep.
Cool.
How do you do that?
Command comma opens up your settings, and I just have editor.font size. If you're on a Windows, then I don't know. So inside of our app, we're now going to want to import our login and our login and index component. So I'm just going to do import index from ./pages/index and import login from pages/login. And we can get rid of those two and just have index. Also, just to, if you find it easier, when you use a default export, you can name it whatever you want. So even though we're exporting in our index page, we're exporting index, we can just call it index page up here. So if that makes it a little more clear to what you're importing, you can do that. I'm just going to keep it as just index and login. So
Just the two import ones that you had to do?
yes. Yeah. So class login. And it says here, cannot resolve pages. Just restart it. If for some reason it still can't find it. Cannot resolve pages, login. Oh. Okay. So I named it .jsx, which is my preference to naming a React component, but I don't think that this is set up to recognize a .jsx file. So I'm just going to use regular .js. Because it's probably going to take too long to figure out how to fix that. Okay, so now we have our index page and we have our login page. So what I'm going to do is steal one component that we did last week, which is going to be our layout component. So if I just go to week 9, or is it? Oh, I did 09 for some reason. Okay, so source, components, layout, and inside of our components, I'm going to create layout.js, paste, and remove helmet, helmet, helmet. And we'll keep that. Okay.
So we're copying everything from your layout.js?
Yeah, if there's anything that's helmet related, we're not going to use helmet for right now. That was just showing that you can manipulate other stuff besides just the tree structure. So being able to edit like the title or other tags. So, but we also don't have a nav bar. So actually it might not be a bad idea to steal nav bar as well. So navbar.js, we'll paste that in. I'm going to change that. Okay. So now we should have, if you took it from last week, there's our layout component and our navbar component that we made last week that we're just going to reuse. And then we have our pages for index and login. So I'm going to take this code and push it up. So create login / index page, create layout and navbar components, and push those up. Okay. The only other thing that we don't actually have in our application is we haven't included Bootstrap into our application. So just by going to Bootstrap's website, documentation, we can just copy it in. And copy this one in. In index.html that is underneath client.
Okay, you copied the CDS?
Correct.
Which links, the second or?
Both of them. So the CSS one will go in the head at the very bottom, and then the .js ones will go at the very bottom. Are you on Get Bootstrap under documentation? What is your version number that's right here? Scroll down and it looks different. Yes.
Sorry, I think I'm a little bit behind. How do you get it to run?
You npm installed,
Yep.
and did you run npm run dev? Also, the people that were on Windows, is it running now on your machine? No, it's not running. Okay. So I'm going to just take a small break there. I know this is even earlier. I think this is the earliest that we've break before. But
not by that much.
yeah, but I would just want to make sure that like when we come back from the break, we can actually have some smooth sailing because the first hour has been pretty rough.
Can you flow back to the index HTML page?
Yeah.
Use the links in?
Yes.
Can we just do the npm install bootstrap?
You can. It's just then you're gonna have to like require it in somewhere and then do some importing. Whereas just taking the CDN links will make that a lot easier.
And we're putting that, sorry, in which index?
Index.html that's under client.
Okay. So go working on yours. Okay, so that's not
Yeah, because you're in the week 10 folder.
And so I just
Yeah,
Yes.
they're in that.
Because when you clone from
There,
GitHub,
because we
it
didn't
creates a folder
that app.
allows it to use the dot syntax and you for it, saying to copy all those files into this folder.
Oh yeah, you gotta take the place on because you added his other code.
And now you want to do additional.
That's all.
Okay. So you know that Axios stuff or?
No, that is an app.
Yeah, so all the things that we've done so far, Axios, there's another one that we did.
They go to app dot one, check it out.
Yeah.
Take that.
Is there anything supposed to show up on the homepage?
Save that.
I just had it, I think I had it something to the next page. Yes. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, the index
Oh, I
minus
thought
the
it was
index.
there.
Yeah, I thought
have
it
you
was
used your layout component in pages yet?
This was
Probably.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually moving.
So when we come back, we're going to be using that layout component, so we'll import it into our index page.
So
Yes.
Oh,
You good?
I see.
For those that have seen 5 minutes
Okay.
there. I don't
I
know.
got it.
No.
It's a Friday.
It's always a Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got the same
Like,
thing.
It's a Friday for the end of the semester.
Oh, reference text?
Okay.
Is this our break or is this just a break?
Okay, so now that we're back, everyone should be having it working on their machine. If not, you can, of course, just download from GitHub. But now we're going to implement our navbar and our layout component into our pages. So now going forward, every page is going to be using our layout component. So that way we can, have like the links that go to different pages. So if we open up our index page, what we're going to do is import layout from, and then we want to go back to components, and we want to import layout. So with the way that we have set this up, we can actually just replace the div that's a part of our index page. So instead of having div, index page div, we can just replace it with layout. And saving that, when we open up our index page, we now have our navbar.
So what did we replace the div with?
With layout, the component that we imported from our components folder. So under components, we have layout, which has our navbar inside of it.
So we still have to do like the open tag, close tag.
Correct. Yeah. And we're going to do the same thing in our login component. And I'm just going to copy paste it just to say login, login, login. So now if I refresh this, and I go to /login, it says login page, home page, login page, home page. Kind of get the idea.
Wait, what? Did we switch to login on the?
We just did the exact same thing on our login page that we did on the index page.
So in the browser, are you calling, like, what does it look like in the URL bar?
Sorry?
Like in the browser?
Yep.
Does it look like, oh, do you have to say /index in order to have
Nope.
the index page?
No, it should just be / for the index page. So to make sure that it's working, if you open up in app.js, you want to make sure that we have two routes. The first one is /login that has the component of login, and then we have just /, and that's rendering our index component.
Yep, it has that.
And then,
And local host 3000, right?
correct.
Yeah, it's not working.
If anyone is wanting to be, oh, you got it? There we go. See? Okay, stop the server. I'm gonna guess that you're running node and not nodemon on dev. That's my best guess. So just make sure under package.json that you've changed dev to using nodemon.
Yes, that's right.
Yep. And then try restarting the server and seeing if Bootstrap is there. Is it working? Have you imported it into your index.html file?
Which one? Oh, in the client?
Yes.
Oh, okay, no, I didn't.
Okay, so that's why. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, there's a lot to getting stuff started up. But what is nice is once you get a project into the configuration that you like, you can just push that up to GitHub as like a boilerplate to use for future projects. So that way you don't always have to go through this tedious process that we just did the first hour of this class. Okay, so the main point of this class was so that we can actually start making API calls to our API. So what we need to do is we need to create a form for our login page and make it so that when we click login, it does a call to a login API. submits, username and password, tries to log in, and returns back if it's a success or not. So what we're going to do is under components, I'm going to create a new component that's called loginform.js. I'm going to import React from React, and I'm going to, instead of using a class component, I'm going to just use a functional component and then pass anything that I need to the login form. So in this case, I'll have const login form equals props and create a form. And I'll have a div with a class name of, what's Bootstrap's thing for, I always forget Bootstrap. Form, I think it's form control, form group. So we want a form group, and we're going to want a couple of these because we're going to want the username and the password. We're going to want a input, and we're going to want 2 of those. This one is going to be of type text. This one is going to be of type password. And this is going to have a class name of form control. Yep.
So I just pulled your most recent GitHub code, and everything is still like blank, like white screen. Plus, I have a thing that says entry point undefined equals index.html.
Okay. Have you tried npm installing? After when you pulled, did you try npm installing after that?
Yeah.
Okay. I will try to help you after we get this working, if that's okay, unless if anyone else would be willing to help out just as I continue this. So we will put in a label for both of these. So this one's going to say email address, this one's going to say password. And then the most important that we're going to need is we're going to need a name, which is going to be password, and a name on this one, which is going to be email. And I'm going to change the type to being type email. And at the bottom, we can export default login form. So if we go to login, we just are greeted with just login page. And what we're going to do is import our login form onto our login page. So the same thing that's with layout, we want to have login form that imports our login form component. And then we want to just render it to the screen. And I'm going to throw it in a div of class name container, just so that it's in the center of our screen. Okay. And I'm going to throw our login page in the text of login page in a h1, and also throw that in our container. So there we go. I feel like I commented out some stuff earlier that made this a little bit easier, but that's fine. Yeah, I did. Okay. Oh no, that set up app route. Should be good. Okay. So we have our login page. And right now, if we type in an email address, so at Georgian college.ca and password of password. Well, for one, we also need a button of type submit and a class name of button primary. And password and click submit. It just throws it into the head right now, into the URL bar. So as opposed to when we had written our forms in Pug, where we say that we want the method to be post and we want the action to be a specific page, what we end up doing in JavaScript is we have a onSubmit function that we give to the form. So what we do is when you're writing for the web, there are a bunch of different triggers that can happen. And I'm sure you guys might remember in the first couple of weeks, I had said that JavaScript is an event-driven programming language, meaning when something happens, such as when you submit a form, you want to do a specific action. So in this case, instead of just letting the default stuff of HTML of submitting a form, what we want to do is we want to hijack it and use our own code. So in this case, we're going to give it a function called onSubmit to our login form, and this is what will run when we submit our form. So inside of our login page, we have to now write the function of what happens when we submit our form. So up top, what we're going to do is write a constructor of props, super props, and we're going to do this dot state, and we're going to have email is empty and password is empty. And lastly, we're going to have a handle login submit. So this gets an event. And lastly, we have to bind it. So can anyone tell me, if they remember from last week, why we bind a function? Correct. So otherwise, because we have state that's up here, we want to be able to access that state and then pass it when we call our function. But if we don't bind it, it doesn't know what this is referring to. Yep.
So does this refer to the state? Do we want it to refer to the state?
It just refers to the object in itself. So
Just React?
not react to the component. So that way, if I rendered multiple login pages, they would be separate. So I wouldn't refer to one state versus the other. It's like this instance of the login page. And because state is attached to this, we want to be able to access that. Does that make sense? Kinda. All right. There's a lot that really goes into it. This, as like a keyword in JavaScript, has a lot of confusing stuff with it. If you write a function, a regular function, like we did right here, so this is a named function, versus if you wrote this, they are not the same. They don't have the same this, which is why we end up having to bind, and we give it the context of this. So there's no, I keep having to say the word this, which is not a good word, but basically when we bind it, it gives it access to that current state, props, everything that is related to that specific component. So it gives it the context to being aware of itself, is the easiest way that I can say. So has anyone ever tried to stop an event? Or does anyone know what event bubbling is? Kind of. You guys have probably gone over it in some other JavaScript classes. So what event bubbling is if you have a form that, in this case, we're trying to submit, it has an event that's triggered to it. So if there's not anything that's handling that event inside of, so if we're not handling the onSubmit in the form, it will bubble up to something else. So in this case, it could bubble up to our div, it could bubble up to our layout. And what this does is it makes it easy sometimes to handle the same scenario across multiple duplicates, if that kind of makes sense. But sometimes that's not what we want to do. We don't want an event to bubble. And sometimes we want to stop what it does by default. So luckily, it has a pretty convenient thing of our event has a function that's called prevent default. And what this does is it prevents the default action of what that event would trigger. So we don't want it to actually submit the form. So what we do is we do E, or in this case, if it was event, we would do event.prevent default. So we say E prevent default. We don't want to submit our form. So now that means that this form, that when we click submit, will not do anything once we pass on submit equals this dot handle submit form. So as before, you can see up here, I have my username, well, email and password from the last time that I submitted the form. If I just remove and I type it in again, so I'll just do test@test.com, test, and I click submit, you see that nothing happens. And that's because I'm preventing the default action of the form being submitted. So now it's kind of like the reins are off, you're in full control, you're welcome to do whatever you want. So this is where I'm going to import Axios. So we npm installed Axios earlier, and what Axios does is it allows us to make a HTTP connection to our server. You can do it to an external application, you can do it to the local application, and I just find that it's very convenient as opposed to using the default fetch API.
How do you make that line go up with
Like this.
Yeah.
I am using Option and arrow up and down. I believe on a Windows it's Control if you're using Visual Studio Code. If not, try Alt. So instead of having to like cut and paste or copy, delete line, paste, it's kind of convenient shortcut. So in order to submit our form, what we want to do is we want to use Axios, and we want to post to our /API/login. So in order to give it the data, what we end up doing is giving it a second parameter of our username and password. So in this case, I'm going to pull in const username, actually I think it's email and password from this dot state, and I want to give it an email and password. That's it. It's not actually it, but this will make the call to our API. The only thing that we aren't doing anything with it is we don't know what response comes back. We don't know if everything was all good or if it was wrong password, if that user doesn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. There's like a bajillion different use cases that something would either succeed or fail. Well, one if it would succeed, a lot more to fail. But what we can do is when we submit this, so I'm going to do test@test.com, give it a password of test, click submit, and in here, should be able to see somewhere, doesn't look like it did it, but what I'm going to do is we have gone over promises a little bit before, and what these do is when something is either successful or not successful, we can trigger an action after that is done because we don't know how long this is going to take. So we're going to have our response, and we're just going to console log the response if it's successful. But if it's unsuccessful using catch, it's going to return an error, and we're going to console error our error. So if I save that and refresh, I'm going to open up our inspect element and look at our console. So now I type in test@test.com, password of test, submit, and we get a 404. And the reason that we get a 404 is because our login route in our API doesn't exist right now. So that's kind of expected behavior. If something doesn't exist, you typically get a 404. So that's why we're getting that right here. So if we open up, I'm going to close everything because sometimes I find it easier if you're working in the client, only have client files open. If you're working on the API, only have the server files open. Don't mix and match. Sometimes you can get confused. So I'm going to close the folder for client. Actually, I'm going to commit this. So git commit login form and Axios post to API login. Push that up. And inside of our API, we have our index. What I'm going to do is change this to being, I'm just going to remove this actually. So post, and we want /login. And this is going to give us our same that we're kind of used to, our response or request response and the next objects. And in this case, I'm just going to res.status, we're going to give it a 200, and then JSON, we're going to give it foo and bar. So now, with very minimal, if I click submit, we now get a success of when it happens, because now our route is set up. So that's pretty good. In here we can look at the data that comes back, and you see here that says foo.bar. So we see the data. It has headers that end up coming back. So sometimes people will throw additional information, like meta information will be inside of headers, but is not really important. And then we can see the request that we sent and the status. So the status being the status code that we set. So now what we need to do is connect to some sort of thing. So usually at this point we would use like our mongoose model to connect to mongoddb and verify our email address and password. Right now I'm just going to set up something locally just to make it a little bit easier instead of having to copy paste our model. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to create a person, and they're going to have a email of test@test.com. They're going to have a password of test. So what we want to do is we want to compare the request body. In the same way that we check the request body when we do a regular form, we actually get this in here. So I'm going to console log request body and submit this. Right here. Sorry, there's a lot of stuff that ends up getting logged. So you can see right here that our email and password is empty. Does anyone know why our email address is empty or password is empty?
Need what?
Sorry?
Is it like a node package that you need?
Nope. Nope, everything that is on the server end is correct. So it's kind of like a small hint. It's on the front end. So we can handle it after, but just to show you, so right now we are getting a value of an email address and a password. It just happens to be, where did it go? Right here. Yep, found it. The email address and password just happened to be blank, which obviously would be incorrect. So what we're going to do is we're just going to compare the email address and password that come in. And instead of actually creating a person, I'm just going to do const email is this, and const password is that. So I'm going to do a check. So if email equals request.body.email and password triple equals request.body.password, we want to respond back saying success of true. So I'm just going to use .json because by default it will do that. Otherwise, we want to respond back saying success of false. And here's the thing that's important, is we want to use a status code. So status codes are useful for front-end applications because without knowing what response is in here, we can check the status code and they have specific meanings. So HTTP status codes, I don't expect you guys to remember this, but there's some good ones. Is 200 just means that everything was okay. That means a normal success. But what we want is a client error. So a server error is a 500 plus status code, so anything that's in the 500 range. And what this means is there is an error on the server. But in this case, it's a client error, so we want something that's a 400 status code. And we'll probably end up using this 401. And that just means unauthorized. So when it comes back to the, in our front-end application, we can handle a 401 as knowing that the password was incorrect or a username was incorrect.
Do you know the origin of 418?
418, I'm a teapot. Yeah, that one was a joke one that was submitted on April Fool's Day and isn't actually like really used. Does anyone know the origin of the webcam at all? So the origin of the webcam was actually set up by a bunch of like geeks that they set up a camera that would look at a kettle to know if there, well, I don't know if it was a kettle or like a coffee pot, but to know if there was still coffee. So that was how it ended up working. And then they would be able to go to a stream to being able to see if there was coffee in the coffee pot or not. So that was, that was why it was set up. And in a similar thing, I'm a teapot kind of originates from that, where if you tried to make a request to a certain IP address, it would respond back to letting you know that I'm not a server, I'm a teapot. So that's where it comes from. It's kind of a silly little thing, but you can use it. There's been errors where people try to use it internally and it ends up sometimes leaking out externally. There was one that happened 6 months to a year ago where every request was responding back with I'm a teapot, and there was a big issue with it for about almost like 24 hours, like a major service, like something like Google, but it wasn't Google. Okay, so in here, I said we want to use a status code of 401. And now when we send this, I'm just going to clear the logs, and we'll just go to everything. So if I click submit, we get a 401. And the reason why we're getting a 401 is because we're not sending our email and password correctly to the server. So you'll see here that, let me close this. Inside of our login component, we have our state for an email address and password. We take that email address and password from state, we send it, we do a post request, but we never set the email address and password, which is why it's always going to be empty. So even though we type into this input box, it never actually knows what to do. So there's two types of inputs in React. So there is what is called a controlled component, which means that you are manually setting the value of that input every single time, and you capture a handled change, and then you modify the state. So if I were to, I don't have paint. That's the only downside about Mac, is you don't have paint.
Is it pretty,
I don't think Windows has it.
is it pretty lit browser?
Windows has it.
Yeah. Oh no, it has it.
No.
I thought he does
Yeah.
Photoshop stuff.
But you can kind of think of it as a, I'm going to use the Blackboard because why not? So we have our login, and we have our email. I apologize to people on the video who won't be able to see this. So our login form has a state of email. So in this case, it'll be an empty string. So what ends up happening is when this input box for email makes a change, it will trigger a function in our login component. And what that will do is it will then modify the state. Because the state changes, the state will now be passed to our input box to let it know what its new value is. So that is what is called a controlled component. So you are explicit on what the value is and what happens when it changes. Whereas an uncontrolled component is a little bit harder. You have to basically usually you use a reference. So you give the input a reference, you give the password a reference, and then when you submit it, you just want to grab the value from it in a way that you guys have probably used with like jQuery. You know, you can do like, you find an element by its ID or by its class name or whatever, and then you do like .value on it to get its value. In this case, you use ref.current.value, but it's a similar kind of process. This is way easier to handle when you start getting into large forms. You don't want to have to manually check every single reference. So what we're going to do is we need two things. We need a function that will update the state. So in this case, we're going to do handle login change with an event. And same thing, we're going to bind that. And then we have to pass our values to our component. So what I'm going to do here is create a value called login values. And this is going to be an object of email is this.state.email. And password is this.state.password. There's tons of different ways that you could do this. You could just actually give it in our login form. You could say email is this, password is this. But sometimes I just like to do values equals and then give it a object of our different values that we just created. So we have our login values, and we're also going to do a onChange. So onChange, we want this dot handle login change. So this is just kind of putting it all in one line. That's fine.
You didn't actually type in login. Did you mean?
No, I didn't. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Handle login change. There we go. So now we've passed it two additional properties, values and onChange, and we still have the onSubmit. So inside of our login form, what we can do is, I'm just going to take this out. So right now, there's two different ways that you can use a functional component after your fat arrow or your equals greater than symbol. Is you can either use parentheses or you can use like the squiggly brackets. So if you use the parentheses, you actually cannot declare any variables because it's just returning the result of what it would be. So it would be the equivalent of if I wrap this in squiggly brackets and then said return. So that will format it like that. So that's what it ends up doing. If you want to declare anything at the top, you can do that. And in this case, I'm going to do props.values. Actually, I'm going to spread this open. On submit, values, and on change. Okay. So now we need to know email and password. So in this case, on our input, we're going to have value equals email and value equals password on our password input. So now we're explicitly saying that this input at the very beginning is going to have a value of an empty string, and then the same thing with the password. So if I refresh this now and I try to type, so here's the thing. We get a little warning in our console log that says an input element should have, well, actually, sorry, that's not the one that I thought I was going to do. This one right here, up above. So because we provided a value property to an input, we should also provide it an on change, because otherwise, if we don't know how to handle the change, it's always going to be an empty string. So if I could type as much as I want, and it doesn't change. So in order to handle that, what we want to do is say on change equals on change in both of them. And I really don't like this prettier setting. Whatever this is dumb. There we go. That looks better, I think. But now I get that. Okay, maybe I'll undo that. Oh. Hate when people have bad configs, in my opinion. I don't like it. I prefer it to be on separate lines. So in the same way that we had to handle our event here, we also have to handle our event for the change, because otherwise we're giving it an on change event, but we're not actually doing anything with it. So if we take, well, I'm just going to console log our event when we try to change something. So if I refresh that and I type E, we get an event that has a whole bunch of information. We get a target, and in this case it's null when we try to open it, because the event doesn't exist anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log out e.target. Has anyone ever done event.target? Do you guys know where I'm going with this, with the value and name? Cool, some people do. So in this case, when I do this, I now get my input box. So because I can just, let's throw, I'm going to create a variable. So const target equals e.target, and I'm going to put a debugger statement right here. So refresh. So when I type in E, you can actually see that my input box gets a value of E. And if I just ignore that, it actually gets set back to being empty. So when I type in E, it triggers my function, and you see that I have target right here. So this is the target. It's the input box that it's coming from. And it has, at the very bottom, it has a value of E. Or in this case, I could just do target.value, console log that as E, and I also need its name, which is email. So what I can do is up here, I can say const name and value. Those are what I want. And I want that to come from e.target. But now I need to change that value in state. So I do this.setState, and I want to change the name to being the value, and that's it. So when I do those square brackets, it takes the actual literal of what the value of name is instead of just changing the prop of name. So make sure if you're doing this that you need to put it in square brackets so it uses it instead of trying to change the prop of name. So, whoops. So refresh that. So now when I start actually changing this, I can now do test at test.com. And when I open up React, you can go into our login and you can see the state right here. So you can see email, and when I start typing in the password, you can see that my password is right there in the tools. So that's pretty handy. I can just type in whatever. But in this case, I want to test that our login API that we created earlier is not working. So what I set up for the email and password is test@test.com with a password of test. So if I give it test1 and click submit, I get a 401. So that's not correct. So if I give it the password of test, we get back a 200 with a data of success being true. So this is how you end up taking your front-end application to communicate with your back-end application in order to do stuff there. So what we want to do in our login form is we're going to have a is logged in of false and has error of false. So there's two things. We have checking if they're logged in and if they have an error. So in here, if we get back an error, I'm just going to do this dot set state has error of true. And up here, if we get a successful response, I want to do this dot set state of has error of false and is logged in of true. I can just remove the console logging of the response. And I'm just going to do two things. So one, I want to check if this dot state dot has error. I want to render just a div that said there was an error logging in. And I'm going to do another one that says this dot state dot is logged in with a div saying you have successfully logged in. So I can save both of those.
Correct.
Yep.
Sorry, go back to what you just said. What's that? Is that an ampersand?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
You're saying like if there is an error, then display the div?
Yes.
How does the? I thought the double ampersand was like if this is true and this is true.
Correct. So are you familiar with a ternary operator? So ternary is, let's say, so we want to know this value, and we check if this dot state dot has error. So if it's true, then we want it to be yes. Otherwise, we want it to be no. So what you can actually do is we say this dot state dot has error, and because this is true, if we do a double ampersand, it will end up returning this value instead. So it's what is called a short circuit operator. So we can short circuit it by going to that. You can also do the exact same thing by saying if this dot state dot has error is false, we can say or, meaning that it goes to the next one, and it returns true.
Oh, okay.
So
if you use the ampersand and it's not true, it just doesn't do anything.
correct. So it will only render this if has error is true, in which case then it will just grab the div and render it. It's pretty common in React to write stuff like this because otherwise you just end up going like, if it has an error, do this, otherwise do nothing, which is like, if you have to keep doing that over and over and over again, it's kind of dumb. So it's just kind of easier to do that. So now if I do this, okay, so now I have test@test.com. I give it a I'm just typing in password. It says there was an error logging in. I can type again, submit, still an error. More, still an error. And now I type in test. It says that you've successfully logged in. So at this point, this is where on the client side, you would end up saving some sort of resource so that way the client knows that they're logged in, because the front-end application is now separate from the server. So when we were using Pug before and we logged in using Passport, we would be able to dictate what HTML is sent to the user, but we can't do that anymore. So have you guys gone over JWTs at all? JSON Web Tokens, kind of, maybe a little bit. What a JSON Web Token is it has 3 parts. And it is pretty common using in, so it's used quite often in front-end applications. So it has 3 parts. So it has a header, which is usually kind of like metadata about the JSON Web Token. Then it has a payload, which is information that is usually created with the sole purpose of why we're giving you this JSON Web Token. And then it has a signature. So it comes in 3 parts. And the reason why we do this is if we want to protect certain parts of our application from the front end talking to it. Because right now, there's nothing stopping me opening up Postman. So Postman is a tool for testing APIs, by the way, or can be. So if I just take localhost API login, and I'll give it a username or email of test@test.com, and I can give it a password of test, and I click send, I get a success of true. But if I had set up an API resource that's not even a post, it's just like a get resource that would say have some pretty important information in it, and I only want that information to be used by someone that has logged in, what we do is we use a JSON Web Token to say like, hey, you haven't logged into the application. You're not able to request this information. So if for some reason, let's say I have listings and I want to just get listings, right now I'm getting nothing. But if I were to set it up, I could actually block access to certain parts of the API unless if you're logged in. So what would happen is inside of our server API, when we successfully log in, we would actually respond back with the JSON Web Token that we created. Yeah, so let's see. So now what we should do is make it so that when we successfully log in, we can just redirect to the index page, which we have done before, but just make it reaffirm that. So inside of our client pages login, we should be able to just import router from our props. Let's just double check. Login has history, no, location. Okay. So, oh, we have history. Okay. So what we can just do is on here, we can do this.props.history.push, and we'll say /index instead of setting state there. So now if I refresh, do test@test.com, password of test, click submit, and it brings us to the index page. So I'm going to push this code up right now. So git status So we went over controlled inputs and submit login form to API. And I should probably put in some comments. Prevent default behavior of form. Grab email password from state. Post API call to login. Redirect on success. Show error message when error. Okay. And we'll bind our functions. Okay. Is there any questions about what we have done?
Do you have to say your typing skills are like
Hey.
Rude.
Yeah.
I'm just commenting on how good of a keyboard typer you are.
Well, thank you. That was such a backhand compliment. So that wasn't a question. Does anyone have a real question?
Why is your typing better than
Because I work 8 hours a day at a computer. I don't work 8 hours a day with a pen. Although I think if I worked 8 hours a day with a pen, then it probably would not improve still. Okay.
Did you push that?
Great question. I did not add the comments. There. Now it's pushed up. Yeah, that's like the one thing that like I apologize for is like I know that I'm a fast typer, so sometimes you guys trying to continue to write down what I am writing can sometimes be a little bit difficult. I'm sure if I wrote everything on the blackboard, you guys would love that a lot more. Okay. So do you guys want any more examples on what we're doing here, or do you guys just want some time to work on your assignment 2 and me be here for any questions? Which do you guys have a preference?
Sorry, repeat those options.
Okay, 2 options. We can either do a couple more examples of how to communicate with the front-end application to the back-end, or we can work on assignment 2, part 2, and I can be here to answer any questions and assist.
That one.
2? Yep. And 2? Is there anyone that wants more examples? Just answer that one. That probably sounds like a no. Who wants more work? Alrighty. So I'll stop the video there, and I'll just be here for any assistance. I can also like help out with anything that we did in class today, obviously, as well. So with that being said, I'm ending the stream.